Listen, if your book does not contain swords, dragons, magic, things that require extreme world building, like if there is not a map on the front page of your book, it doesn't need to be 488 pages. If you're new here, hey, I'm Marissa, and my videos are all about making sports a little bit more accessible to people who typically feel cut out of those sports fandoms. One of the ways that I do that is with this series, where I review sports romance books and tell you how much of the sport you would learn if you were reading the book. What we're hoping for are books that are as close to accurate as possible, while still bringing you a romantic storyline that might be your hook into the sport. And today we are talking about Downforce by Hannah Lily. This is a Formula One romance book, so that is the sport that we are discussing today, and I think this is maybe the most conflicted I have been about a book so far in this series. As a side note, before we get started, this is my favorite note that I left in the Kindle version of the book, and I would love for you, before we get to the end of this review, to leave in the comments what word you think it was. I promise I will tell you in the end. Before we get too deep into the book, I am going to throw the content warnings on the screen from the book. These I found to be actually very accurate to what was depicted in the book, and the one heads up that I would give you if you are a reader on Kindle, which this is not the author's fault, Kindle automatically skips the content warning page. So make sure you scroll back to see that if it's important to you. That's just a tip in general for reading on Kindle. I've noticed that the app for some reason skips over a number of pages when you open the book for the first time. First, let's talk about the basic stats of the book. As I mentioned in my opening, this is a 488-page romance novel. It's not a fantasy novel, there's not a lot of world building that needed to be done, and I desperately needed it to be about 150 pages shorter, because unfortunately, this book has a lot of scenes that just don't need to be there. And if we're talking about how much of that book is actually racing action or connected to Formula One, there's actually quite a bit at the beginning, which is part of why I feel so conflicted about this one. Our male main character is Jonah Scott. He's a third-generation Formula One driver. Both his dad and his grandfather appeared to be pretty legendary drivers. He's Canadian, he's in his 4th season of Formula One. He has not yet won a championship, and he drives for Durand Racing, which, by the way, most Formula One books, you're not going to see the names of the actual teams on the grid, which I do always find interesting because I feel like these books have a chance to kind of create their own idea of what the team culture looks like. Durand Racing is a team that seems to have pretty big legacy. There is this idea of them being winners, this idea that Jonah is holding them back, and the fact that both his dad and his grandfather drove for this team and won championships with them. And then our female main character is Olivia Fraser. She's 26 years old and a Formula One presenter for a show called The Formula Way. She's also a little bit of a nepo baby, given that the show that she works for is run by her godmother, and this is her first year following the circuit as a reporter. I found this book because it was recommended by a couple of you guys when I asked for different sports romance novels that you wanted me to cover. And when I read the setup of these two characters, one who's a Formula One driver and one who is a Formula One presenter, I thought, okay, this is a dual perspective book. It's pretty evenly split down the middle between Jonah and Olivia's chapters, and I feel like just by nature of their jobs and the way that they're going to interact, there's a lot of potential for teaching someone about Formula One through this story. And that's actually not necessarily untrue. I was pretty excited about that being something that we would see in this book, and we do in a lot of portions of it. So I'm going to talk about that first. Let's talk about how much Formula One is in this book and how accurate it is. This book actually throws you right into the action of what it would be like to be a driver. The very first scene in this book is right after the Monaco race, which, you know, I dressed appropriately, and Jonah has just been pushed off the track by his teammate, ending his race. He's obviously not happy about this. He storms back into the team garage, and we do get quite a bit of information right off the bat about Formula One. We get the terminology that comes with winning races and podiums. So if you were reading this book and you were new to Formula One, in the first chapter, you would very quickly understand a few vocabulary things. First, there's the idea of the podium, or podiuming, or missing out on the podium being P1, P2, and P3, those top 3 finishers of the race. You also get a couple of other terms like the idea of a 1-2 for the team, meaning that both drivers would have finished first and second. And you also very quickly get the idea of a driver having to go from a pretty terrible race straight into media, having to speak positively or at least not poorly about a teammate that did something that ruined their own race, and the idea of a team dynamic and 2 drivers competing directly against each other, because that is one of the biggest things in Formula One. The only person on the grid who's exactly competitive with you is your direct teammate who has the exact same car as you. So in that sense, we were off to a very promising start with this book. I think it throws you pretty instantly into this world of Formula One, the sport, what it feels like to be part of the team, and this high stakes, highly emotional scene to kind of throw you right into it. They also don't start off with the top of the season. We're already in Monaco here, and I think that was a smart choice. Throw us right into the action, throw us into the drama, and keep us in a position where we already know what the stakes of the season are. Put us in a place where Jonah is already worried about returning. So that as a whole is great. And there's also these different portions of the book where things are explained very clearly and very accurately. And I do want to talk about those and the positive aspects of it. But the part where the book does kind of lose a little bit of credibility with how well it knows Formula One and how well it can teach it to you are the sort of creative liberties that are taken to create this world of Formula One and Jonah's kind of expectations. Because while a lot of the facts are accurate, some of the backstory that we get is a little surprising. So for example, in the first chapter, we find out that Jonah's grandfather has 5 world championship titles. His dad has 7. That would put both his dad and his grandfather, especially his dad, in the category of like greatest of all time drivers. The highest number of world championships that anyone has ever won is 7, which is also what Jonah's dad has here. And And then there's the sticky part where we find out that both of these drivers won their world championships in their rookie season. Now again, anything is possible, but the only person in the history of Formula One to win a driver's championship their rookie season was the person who won the driver's championship the first time it ever existed, which is a long, convoluted way of telling you that no one's ever done that. Lewis Hamilton, who is largely regarded as the greatest of all time, got very close by missing out on the driver's championship his rookie season by 1 point, but that would be like shocking behavior for two people to do it and then go on to be so insanely great. And the part that's hard about that is that those are the little things that change this book from being so accurate to taking things like one step too far that weren't necessary and then make you kind of nitpick the rest of the book. Because there are a lot of moments in this book where you're like, oh, things are so realistic, things are so accurate. And then for the sake of the story, we take like 12 leaps way too far out of the realm of reality. And then the whole thing sort of just falls apart like a house of cards. On the flip side, we have this setup from the romance that Jonah hates Olivia off the bat. And we get this idea that that hatred comes specifically from her reporting. She's reporting on his career honestly and openly, which unfortunately he's made a lot of mistakes in, and he takes a lot of that personally and internalizes it, and his self-esteem is just not great throughout the book. That being said, we do get some quick good descriptions of how the Formula One paddock is laid out from Olivia's work as a journalist, so you would have an idea of like how the paddock is laid out, how things travel, some of those nitpicky details that are actually quite interesting. She talks about motorhomes, the garages, how things are moved from city to city, and again, a lot of that is pretty accurate and interesting until we go, again, a little bit of a step too far, where we then have a reporter who's left alone in the garage, which is something that feels like it would not happen. As someone who has been lucky enough to be in a Formula One garage, it's a very controlled atmosphere. There are very specific places where you're allowed to stand, and you are definitely never left unsupervised. So again, it was one of those moments for me where I was reading and I was like, this is so accurate, this is so interesting, this is so good, and then, this is breaking the realm of reality. But there are some really good things that I think Olivia's character does a good job of bringing us into. We get a conversation about driver moves, which gives you this idea that there are 20 seats available on the grid, how people move between them, how drivers are not expected to stay at the same team forever, and also how cutthroat the sport can be, which I think is good information. I think this book does a good job of kind of giving you the idea of both the sport side of it, the driver side, and also the business side of how these drivers are moving from place to place, how contracts work, without being too sort of textbooky. So again, a good, interesting part of this book that is at that point pretty accurate. So rather than going back and forth and showing you all of the places where I liked it and I didn't like it, I just want to run through a couple of things that were surprising to me and I thought were actually pretty good from an educational standpoint. Number one, we do get some really good on-track scenes, both from Jonah's perspective as a driver and from Olivia's perspective when she might be commentating on a race or reporting on it or watching it to report on it. I liked how much racing action you get at the beginning portion of this book. For the first like 30%, you're actually pretty locked into this idea of Formula One, of the racing action, of the sport, how it works and how they're moving from race to race, and the idea of reporting on it and what that would look like. There's also some really good detail put into place in this book. We get a whole scene where Jonah actually finishes a race, goes into Parc Ferme, gets out of the car, gets weighed, weighs the car, goes through all of the different aspects that are actually pretty important when it comes to the sport itself, and that would be easy to gloss over if you were just writing a story about Formula One. So this is one of the few sports romance books I've read where I've seen like a really big attention to those types of details, things that happen when the car is turned off, when you're not actually on the track in a race, and like little details that I really like as a sports fan and as a fan of Formula One. We also even get an explanation of the installation lap, which I think is something that most fans who watch on TV don't even think about. We get a pre-race briefing. We even get Jonah warming up before a race with his personal trainer, which is great. From the racing action, there is one part that I want to point out that I actually really enjoyed. We get a whole stretch of a race where we see Jonah actually discussing tire strategy with the pit wall, an explanation of how a safety car gives you a free pit stop, and a discussion of how different tires give you different advantages in a race. This part I thought was really well done, especially because they actually do a good job of mixing in this drama between the two teammates and how the team is actively favoring one driver over another, which is something that we've even seen in this Formula One season. It's been like a hot topic of conversation. So that part I actually really liked. And again, that's in that first 30% of the book. So you can really tell that the author of this book, Hannah Lily, cared about the sport. She wanted to put as much of the sport in as she could. And even though there are points where I feel like this book goes past the realm of what's true in the sport or other small details that I've mentioned before, I didn't like that those things were wrong and that they took a step too far. But I do think it would be unfair to say that this author didn't do her research, because I think honestly for the first 30% of this book, this is very clearly someone who did do a lot of research. And for that specific reason, I do want to applaud the author, because I do feel like a lot of sports romance books, especially Formula One, are doing sort of basic research. And this does feel like someone spent a lot of time trying to understand the sport before writing about it, even sometimes to their detriment, because there are parts of this book that kind of read like a textbook, where there's a quick aside to explain what something is rather than kind of showing it, and you get sort of a classroom style explanation of that part of the sport. So one thing I won't say about this author is that they did not do their research, because I think they did. I think they just took certain points to kind of try to push their story forward or build their world that step outside of the realm of the sport. But again, when we're talking about fiction, you can't always make something completely perfect or completely accurate. So what I would say is that if you wanted someone to understand the basics of Formula One in a fictional manner, you could hand them this book and ask them to read the first 30% of it. The part that I would say that makes me so conflicted about this book is that the romance is where it all fell apart for me. There were so many aspects of the romance itself that made me so stressed, and not in like a fun, romantic, I can't wait to see what happens way. In the way where I was like, this romance, if happening in real life, would be a large workplace harassment lawsuit. The setup of the romance is that Jonah and Olivia cannot stand each other, and they consistently put themselves in these situations where they are in front of cameras and do things that are wildly unprofessional. We start the romance portion off with Olivia being tricked into going to a party with her boss/godmother, and then being rapidly abandoned at said party. Somehow fates align and she runs into Jonah, who immediately can't stand her, and Dylan, another driver on the grid who she knows through interviewing him previously. This whole meetup situation is fine, and it ends in what I thought might be an inciting incident for the romance and for the book to kind of really kick off, which is that Olivia and Jonah are photographed outside together, visibly drunk, and he is kneeling down to take her shoes off for her. Those photographs then make their way around the internet, and we get kind of a vague acknowledgement that there are rumors that they might be dating. Now here is where I thought that the romance would kick off, but we go for another large portion of this book without really acknowledging or understanding what's going on in the outside world. And then we get two more instances between the two of them. There's an interview where Olivia is hosting and they just suddenly start shouting at each other, and the footage from that is then leaked. And then there's kind of a mixed explanation of whether or not the rumors that they're dating are getting worse, or if it's just that the PR situation is bad because Jonah looks bad. But then another good chunk of the book goes by before we have them kind of try to fix the situation again. And the way they try to fix that is by doing a hot lap interview. Except that goes really poorly because Olivia has a well-known reason why she's not comfortable being in cars that are going fast. It's not shared with Jonah, and they still set up a hot lap interview knowing that Olivia probably shouldn't do that. She has a meltdown, a bit of a panic attack, and then that footage of her crying is leaked on the internet. And then that takes a sharp pivot and we talk about the idea of sexism and whether or not women should be in the motorsport space. And there's a lot of complaints put out there, and we're still not at this point at the big inciting incident of their romance. They have begun flirting heavily, but we get all the way to summer break. Jonah and Olivia are told that they're going to be going on a road trip together. Both of them are already on the road with nothing packed. There's no explanation of like clothes, shopping, anything like that. And despite the fact that Olivia is actually a reporter, she suddenly becomes like an Instagram influencer in this book. And the idea is that they are expected to go to a number of cities for 5 days, and Olivia will make one Instagram reel per day, which Jonah will then share to his Instagram stories. Now here is where I was officially lost from this book, which unfortunately started out in a way that I was like, this is the one, this is the book I've been looking for. We have a heavy focus on the fact that Olivia is not being taken seriously because she is a woman. Then we also have a PR crisis that was started because people believe that Olivia, a reporter, and Jonah, a Formula One driver, are dating. So our solve to that type of crisis is that we're going to send them on a road trip together where they will make aesthetic Instagram reels and do no sort of reporting, and hope that that stops the rumors of them dating. And definitely it's going to stop the sexist comments that Olivia is receiving as a reporter in this space. This is where I was like, okay, I don't know where this is going, and I don't feel great about it, but I'm already in too deep. And then they actually go on the road trip. And when they get to the first hotel, they find out that only one hotel room has been booked. I don't know how to like contain myself on this one, because the hotel rooms have been booked by their bosses, who have collectively agreed that these two people who genuinely hate each other, who are being forced to go on a work trip together, who already have public rumors that they might be dating that are detrimental to both of their reputations, we're gonna book them one hotel room and hope that no one sues us. That was the part that really it lost me, because I was sitting there and I was like, okay, we know that these two characters are attracted to each other, but this is still a work mandated trip. How is it possible that they're being put onto this as a reputational like solve, like a way to make these two characters seem more professional, but we're gonna put them in one hotel room? I want everyone to remember that workplace harassment and sexual harassment lawsuits exist, which also just is at war with this core concept of this book about sexism in the workplace, especially when it comes to motorsports. So again, this is the conflicted part for me, right? Because I've already told you there's a lot of really accurate F1 stuff to this book, but then for them to actually fall in love with each other, we have to go down this path that I was like hoping either of them had a lawyer on speed dial. And then as we continue to go through this, the reels that she's posting are basically like highlight reels of being on a romantic vacation with someone. They have nothing to do with racing. There is no conversation about the sport itself. There's no interview aspect of it, given that she's a reporter and he's a driver. I thought when it was first proposed, we'd be going down this sort of like road trip style reality TV show documentary thing, some sort of element where we have like a camera crew involved, not this reporter's iPhone. But that is just not, that's not what happens. We're getting like aesthetic reels that are posted once a day and definitely make them look like they're together. There's also no mandate or brief put together for them. There's no explanation of anything other than they want them to go to these different cities, go to these hotel rooms that, again, one hotel room for the two of them. There's one activity that they have to do each time. Obviously, as this continues, people think that they're dating because of the fact that they're already attracted to each other. We're like ramping up the sexual tension, right? Which would be fine, except for the fact that Olivia truly believes that if she dates a Formula One driver, she will not be taken seriously in this space. And the hard part about this is at this point, I don't take her seriously. It has nothing to do with the fact that she's attracted to the driver. It has everything to do with the fact that this looks so unprofessional across the board. But regardless, as things start to kind of build between the two of them and you think maybe they're just gonna cross a line and then we'll deal with that for the second half of the book once they go back to the sport, they certainly cross some lines in my opinion. But in doing so, Olivia comes up with this grand idea that if they just make a bet that they can tease each other as much as they want, as long as they don't cross one very specific line, that's okay. There are no real explanations of what these characters will win if it's a bet, other than that they'll definitely be allowed to do the thing that crossing the line and losing the bet would be. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm kind of talking in coded language because I don't want to spoil the entire book, but basically there's a bet set out that they are not going to cross a certain line, but they are allowed to try to tease the other person to cross that line as much as they want. Not really sure how this is going to keep Olivia from being seen as unprofessional or to make any of these rumors die down, because a lot of that teasing takes place in public places. I just was so mind blown the entire time. And I don't want to spoil the whole book in case you do want to read it, because again, I do think there are aspects of this book that were interesting and well done, well researched, etc. But for the romance side of it, we do see them finally get together, and then that part really does fall apart when it comes to her ability to be taken seriously, these rumors, all of these different things that we were hoping would work. Everything just kind of gets thrown together at the end, in my opinion, because Olivia decides that she doesn't want to be a reporter anymore. After she's called Jonah's girlfriend on a broadcast, which she doesn't deny and goes on a rant about the fact that women aren't taken seriously in this field, she then comes up with this idea that she doesn't want to be a Formula One presenter anymore. She wants to make what she calls a platform for women in motorsports and female fans of motorsports to be taken seriously, which would be really cool if we saw any of the aspects of this storyline kind of come to fruition. There's a whole subplot about a female F3 driver who's kind of trying to make her way up the ranks, but that gets lost because at the beginning of the book, when we're really focused on the sport, that driver is winning every race back to back, literally something that she says has never been done since Jonah was in Formula 3. But when we come back from this road trip, all of a sudden she is at a point where she may lose the championship. We never get any explanation as to when she started losing races. We never see Olivia do any of this reporting. We see her try to get like an unsanctioned, unplanned interview with Amelia, the driver, after she's on the podium. And we get this quick aside from that driver saying, "I know you, you're the girl who's dating Jonah." The whole message of like sexism in this sport, which I think is actually a really important one, gets lost because Olivia doesn't really do anything to change that. In the end, we see her start her own journalism website, which is literally a ripoff of the company that she works for in the first place. The company she works for in the first place is called The Formula Way, and she comes up with The Female Way. There's no explanation of how anything that she's going to do on this website is any different than what she's been doing as a journalist. And in fact, she kicks this whole website launch off, which she's hoping will make her seem more legitimate and not connected to a driver, by getting an exclusive from her boyfriend, who literally says these are the benefits of dating a world champion. The other part about this kind of sexism situation is that after Olivia is referred to as Jonah's boyfriend while she's commentating on FP3, she has this extreme breakdown where Jonah eventually comes home and finds her surrounded by printouts of all these different articles and Wikipedia articles about women in motorsports. This also seems to be where she finds out any information about women in motorsports before she started reporting on it. She finds out for the first time that there have only been 5 women in the sport. She comes up with all of these stories that would be pretty basic knowledge. And so what's frustrating about this is there's this really good idea of sexism in motorsports in this book, and the idea that women are not taken seriously and of course would be taken less seriously if they were to fall in love with a Formula One driver. But quite honestly, Olivia doesn't do any of the work that would make her be taken seriously. The fact that she has no prior knowledge of the basics of women in this sport before, of the women who've made a big difference, there's no real understanding as to why she's so passionate about women in this space in the first place. It was frustrating because these are a lot of the same complaints I have about men that come to commentate on things like F1 Academy and don't do the research. So I feel like this book had so many good ideas that were executed in a way that made me want to scream. Because by the end, honestly, I wasn't rooting for Olivia. I was rooting for her to figure something out, but it certainly wasn't what I got from her. So for me, the standpoint on this book that I have is that I do think you would learn a lot about Formula One. That is why I'm so conflicted about it, because a lot of things are really well explained and really quite accurate in the first 30% of this book. There are things that are just like a step too far that don't make any sense, but that really wouldn't change your perception of the sport or what you learned. I actually think if you read the first 30% of this book, you could sit down and watch a Formula One race and understand a lot of it. But then for the rest of it, which again is 488 pages, things just really fly off the rails. The romance really didn't work for me. The believability that this is what would happen in a workplace was just out of control. And to be honest, the ending made me feel like women would not be taken seriously in this world, not with Olivia as a role model. And in in the end, I also think one of the things that gets totally lost in this book is the explanation of the point systems. Because in the end, Jonah does win the world championship. And there are points in this book where the point spread is explained. And that point spread would be about the same as Charles Leclerc taking over Max Verstappen this season. It's completely unbelievable, and it gets lost for a reason that I don't really understand, because it'd be really easy for this author, who clearly understands a lot about the sport, to just keep the reader abreast of how many points he's been scoring and where he is in the championship as we go along. So from a standpoint of how much you would learn about Formula One from this book, I think if you read the first 30%, you'll learn some interesting things. But I think you'd also have to get through a 488-page romance novel to do that. And for me, the romance part of this book is the unbelievable part, which is not what I was expecting. That being said, at the beginning of this video, I told you I would tell you what word inspired this note on my Kindle. The word was masochistic. The author definitely meant to use sadistic, which again, if anybody's read Twilight, everyone knows that the lion fell in love with the lamb. What a stupid lamb. What a sick, masochistic lion. Come on. Anyway, I don't know where I land on this book. I can't say that I would recommend that you read it from a book perspective, but at the same time, I would say this is probably one of the more accurate Formula One romance novels I've read so far. So if someone did pick this up, I think they would learn a lot about the sport. But I also don't know that they would make it to the end, or that they would feel satisfied by the romance itself. That's everything I have on this one. Because American football season is coming up, this is the next book that we'll be doing, The Cheat Sheet. It's an NFL romance. The girl is a ballerina, and to be honest, I'm actually pretty excited about this one. So if you've read Downforce, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought about it. Let me know if you would read this book or if you would recommend it to another person. And of course, if there's another book or sport that you want me to cover in this series, feel free to leave that in the comments as well. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the cheat sheet, any of my explainers, or anything like that. And I will see you on the next one.